Hey, this is Frank with Readphone Studios. Today what we're going to be doing is much more of a design video than a strict art video, because I'm going to be designing one of the card frames for Temporal Shards and talking about where Temporal Shards started and how it got to where it is. Starting from the beginning, which should hopefully seem like the most logical place to start. Temporal Shards started off as a really simple concept that actually was born of a couple of different ideas I had at the time. The initial idea for it was it would be a card all about popular euphemisms, like just sayings that we use every day and maybe don't really think about. Things like kicking the wasp's nest or setting fire to the rain. Just things like that. Things that really don't make that much sense when you actually think about them, but could be used in fun ways in a card game type setting. That kind of evolved into being this game similar to Magic the Gathering, where you would build your own deck of heroes and monsters, and the theme of that version of Temporal Shards was all centered on writing, but that concept wouldn't actually come to have any bearing over the design of the card game until much, much later. But the idea was that you were this god who was only interested in creating the best story possible. The initial idea for how you would actually play the card game was similar to that of the stack in Magic the Gathering, which is an in-game concept that describes the process of one person using a spell and then another person maybe using a spell that would counter that spell, or using another spell that did something else but was still related, or sometimes even it's not related, but it just... But because of the systems that Magic the Gathering uses, you can play cards even against cards that maybe wouldn't be played against one another. And so I sort of had to come up with a physical location for those cards to be played. Or that was the original idea anyways. I'm going to flash up an image of the original card design just so you can see what the cards looked like at the time. And the original most basic version included a whole bunch of unnecessary concepts and ideas that didn't really add anything to the actual game itself, but I just included them because I thought, well, this is what other card games do, I should do the same thing too, right? And I had all these ideas for cute little creatures and a whole bunch of other things. The original name for the game, incidentally, was called Spellcaster Lexicon, and that was actually what the area was called where you played cards to. It was called the Lexicon because that was a word that I really wanted to use for the game, and up until very recently I continued to use that word to describe the main process of the game. But now it's relatively inaccurate compared to what I want the game to be like, so it has been left in the dust, you could say. But as I described before, the story concept for Temporal Shards was that you are this god who wants nothing more than to create fantastical stories. And so I sort of had to create... I had this idea for a world that I had been forming that the original cards were based upon, and those are actually still a lot of the same playing pieces that I'm using now, although the concept has changed a good amount. But going back to the concept has changed a really good amount since I originally concepted the game, and one thing that it's good to get in your head solid early on, or as early on as possible, is what kind of a model you want to have for your card game, whether you want it to be a collectible card game or a board game, and then base a lot of the decisions that you make lore-wise around that, because it is so much harder to do the inverse, which is what I did at the very beginning. I had this idea that I really wanted it to be a collectible card game that was similar to Magic the Gathering, but was a competitor, but not really, because it was intended to be a lot simpler and easier to learn, would be the keyword. But overall, I clung too much to the idea of it being a collectible card game and didn't expand too much about my thinking and what worked best for the game. And so I kept running into these roadblocks about what I want the game to be and how I want it to work and how the different pieces interacted with one another and how it made sense as a board game and as a card game. And it was really just overcomplicated incredibly by my limited thought process. When I eventually decided that it was going to be a board game done and set was actually very recently, and now that I've made that decision, I'm very, very happy with it, because there are so many things more that I can do with it, and I think people are going to enjoy it better because it's a board game rather than a collectible card game. Everything makes sense, and I've chosen a model that isn't, I want to say exploitative, but it's not really, because I think there's a lot of good that the collectible card game open a booster pack format can do, and it's a very enjoyable format. But I think most collectible card games are sort of meant to be this eternal format. Like, you spend all this money on the game, and then if one day it just disappears and suddenly all of your cards are worthless or essentially worthless, or I don't know, I just feel like if I was in a collectible card game for that long and then suddenly it just disappeared, I'd be a little bit upset. But the ultimate point is that I decided to make it a board game, and that opened me up to other avenues of thinking that I hadn't been considering, like the design of the card, because it wasn't a collectible card game anymore. I could be a little bit more flashy with it. Obviously you're seeing me design it right now, but I'll flash up really quick a image of what the previous card frame looked like, which was not the original, but is sort of the second version of it. I think that this card frame works a lot better because I wrote down in a document exactly what I wanted, exactly what I needed, what I thought the card needed to communicate, as opposed to just what looks the coolest, which I think worked for the concepting phase, but it didn't work in the long run, and I figured that out relatively quickly, which was good overall. But this piece gave me a lot of issues, actually, the middle piece, because the idea for the plot point card from the very beginning was this idea of a book, like the cover of a book that's like old red leather with these beautiful gold ornaments and buckles and all that, but I wasn't really thinking about how it would look like that and what aspects I would put into making sure that it looked the theme and really felt beautiful and interesting to look at. But it does eventually come together, which is nice. I end up adding a lot more ornaments than I thought I would, because it looked fairly plain to me just as it was, and so I wanted to cut that back a little bit. But yeah, I would say the most important piece is the concept gameplay wise, because you're never going to you're not going to be able to get very much of anywhere without a solid idea of exactly what you want your game to be like, and it'll be much harder to get other ideas to work together. Like, for a long time I struggled on how the game pieces would sort of work, because if I wanted it to be a collectible card game, then that was one thing, but then I ran into issues of sort of, do I really want to do this, and is this what I think is best for the game, and does it work mechanically? And I was thinking a lot about the board itself, because originally it was the lexicon and a whole bunch of other pieces that were very disparate and didn't really have very much to kind of do with one another, and I really wanted an aspect of player interaction, which once I switched over to the idea of it being more of a story creation game rather than a mages and gods battling each other type game, I was running into that issue of how do I make it interesting by including player choice without making it so horribly overcomplicated that it destroys itself as it goes along. But I think I'll get more into that in the next video, which will be another one of these card frame design videos. And I'll go more into, I think, what sort of happened next and what my ideas were and how I concepted the world and all that sort of fun stuff. For now that the video is kind of drawing more towards its close, I'm going to describe what the various elements of the cards are. There's a lot of visual elements that are essentially just there for making the card look more visually appealing and like the actual cover of a book. Like this buckle here, this doesn't serve any function at all other than making it look like a leather-bound notebook that you would strap shut. And it's intended to look intensely fancy, like all the ornaments are made out of gold, or are at the very least gold plated, like genuine actual gold in this single instance, which I know is not realistic at all. Leather notebooks are already really expensive. Why would you spend the extra coin just to get gold adornments when they don't serve very much of a purpose? What I'm trying to do right here is just design, because each of the plot threads is meant to have an amount of temporal shards. This was sort of meant to be the container for the little image that showed the temporal shards, but it ended up being a little bit tacky and not really working the way that I wanted it to, and it was a little bit frustrating. Yeah, I just fiddled with it, tried changing the color, and it did not look good in gold, so I figured better to just remove it and move the shard down a couple layers so it looks like it's underneath the entire thing rather than... Oh, I didn't realize it was actually recording there. What you just saw was a little... I think I was actually trying to close that Google Chrome window because it was slowing me down a little bit. I had been recording and drawing for a while. I'm starting to think that I should create like a black screen when it cuts between my drawing program and my desktop or other things that I'm trying to do. Anyway, so the last piece of this was to create the, I guess, kind of the set symbol, which is an M standing for the median cycle. And overall, saving, this is how it turned out. I think it turned out really well. I like the texture of the whole thing. I like the feel of it. It really gives me the impression of it being a book that would be bound in leather and would be really beautiful. But yeah, I think that's where I'm gonna end it. Signing off. Bye.